Mr. President, in the coming hours, the Senate could take up the nomination of Elizabeth Darling to serve as Commissioner for Children, Youth, and Families at the Department of Health and Human Services. If she is confirmed to that role, she would be a key official overseeing the foster care system. I previously had a hold on Ms. Darling's nomination, and I'm going to begin my remarks by saying that my hold was never about her personally or about her concerns or about concerns with her qualifications. In fact, I believe she's qualified for the position. I placed a hold on her nomination because of serious problems at the Department of Health and Human Services affecting child welfare policies that would fall in her area of jurisdiction if she's confirmed. And I think this involves a matter that the distinguished President of the Senate might be particularly interested in at this point. I authored with former Finance Committee Chair Senator Orrin Hatch landmark families legislation called the Family First Prevention Act. Family First, that Chairman Hatch and I authored, is a once-in-a-generation bipartisan update of child welfare laws in America, inspired to a great extent by Marian Wright Edelman, the head of the Children's Defense Fund. The implementation of that law, in my view, was moving too slowly. Last week, the Department of Health and Human Services followed through on a request from me and a group of colleagues from both parties and both chambers to open up the availability of prevention programs for states that Chairman Hatch and I felt so strongly about under Family First. This was an important first step, and if Ms. Darling is confirmed, I expect to see the department take more. What I would like to address for a few minutes, though, is a deeply discriminatory policy change that has been made by the Trump administration in the child welfare system. Until the Trump administration intervened, Health and Human Services regulations explicitly banned religious discrimination in federally funded social service programs. Discrimination that should be barred by our core constitutional protections. Unfortunately, under this administration, that safeguard is no more. This year, the Trump administration has set a precedent that foster care agencies that receive federal dollars can turn away qualified prospective foster parents simply because they are Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Mormon, or any other faith, or simply because they are non-believers. What this is all about, in short, is a green light for taxpayer-funded discrimination on the basis of religion. It stems from a case involving Miracle Hill Ministries, a foster agency in South Carolina. Miracle Hill is a faith-based social service organization, the largest provider of foster care services in South Carolina. It serves around 15% of the state's foster care population. I have no reason to doubt that Miracle Hill has a lot of wonderful staff and volunteers who wish to do a great deal of good work. Last year, the governor of South Carolina asked the Department of Health and Human Services for a waiver that would allow Miracle Hill to continue receiving taxpayer dollars despite its practice of turning away qualified foster parents based solely on their religious beliefs. In effect, it was a request for a loophole to evade the federal policy banning religious discrimination. The Department of Health and Human Services okayed it. So at a time, Mr. President, and the President of the Senate and I have talked about this, when you have too many vulnerable kids and too few safe foster homes in America, the Trump administration actually gave the largest foster care organization in South Carolina permission to turn prospective foster parents away because of their faith. This is not an academic matter. Let me give an example of the consequences. Beth Lesser, a woman who unintentionally brought this issue to light, went in 2018 to Miracle Hill Ministries to volunteer as a foster mentor. Before she moved to South Carolina, she was a foster parent in Florida. You would think any foster care organization would be thrilled to have Ms. Lesser walk through their door, an experienced foster care parent coming to volunteer her time and her energy and her love. But during an orientation training, Miracle Hill found what they considered to be a problem. Ms. Lesser, like me, is Jewish. After Miracle Hill discovered Ms. Lesser's religion, they quickly turned her away. Ms. Lesser is not the only person who experienced this discrimination. Another was Amy Madonna, who grew up in a foster care home and has 3 kids of her own. She contacted Miracle Hill, volunteered to open her home and the screening process. But when Miracle Hill learned that Ms. Madonna is Catholic, she got turned away too. She's devastated by the decision. In February, she sued the state of South Carolina and the Department of Health and Human Services over this unconstitutional discrimination. I commend her for fighting for her rights, and I believe she speaks for people of so many faiths that I just mentioned earlier. I do want to explain why I find this precedent the Trump administration has set to be so objectionable, starting with the most obvious. It is horrendous policy because it's going to hurt vulnerable kids all across this country, Mr. President, particularly if and when the Trump administration hand out more waivers in more states. They do it this way, it's going to reduce the number of safe and loving foster homes available to youngsters in the child welfare system. That is the wrong way to go. This policy is going to limit the diversity of foster homes and foster parents. And growing up around people of different views and philosophies and religions, diversity is important for kids. That's particularly important for LGBTQ youth who make up 1 in 5 kids in foster care. They're homes where LGBTQ kids are not safe. They benefit from the chance to grow up in these more inclusive backgrounds where there are more diverse families who respect their sexual orientations and their gender identity. It raises troubling questions about what's going to happen to children who've been raised outside evangelical Christianity before when they enter the child welfare system. What's going to happen to a Jewish kid or a Muslim kid or a Mormon kid who's placed in a home where they're considered heretics? This is a personal matter for me, Mr. President. That kid could have been me. I was so proud of my parents. They fled the Nazis in the 30s. Not all got out. All my dad, just about the most red, white, and blue fellow around, wanted to do was serve in our army so he could drop propaganda pamphlets on the Nazis, telling them they ought to give up. You can read about my dad, Peter Wyden, in the Holocaust Museum. So I was very, very proud of my dad. And I thought about, for example, what might have happened if my parents had died when I was 12 years old in a car crash. And I was put in one of these families, an evangelical family, through a foster agency that discriminates. I could have been told that everything my wonderful, patriotic Jewish parents had taught me to believe was wrong. That my parents, that my dad honored in the Holocaust Museum, that his beliefs were sinful, would have added a lot more difficulty to a situation that's already traumatic. The thought that children who've lost their parents could have another part of their identities stripped away is just appalling. That religious discrimination, and particularly is fundamentally un-American act. The idea it's going to be propped up with federal tax dollars is just wrong. In my view, what the Trump administration has done with the South Carolina waiver is unconstitutional. I also believe it's just the latest iteration of a much larger assault on individual religious liberty. From a legal perspective, the Department of Health and Human Services justifies its discriminatory waiver by pointing to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, what is known as RFRA. Here's the problem. That law was intended to stop religious discrimination, not promote it. In this case, however, the administration is interpreting that law to protect only the religious freedom of Miracle Hill, not the freedom of Jewish or Catholic or Muslim or Buddhist individuals who want to become foster parents in South Carolina. HHS's waiver disregards the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits the government from, and I quote, respecting an establishment of religion. This is a federal agency using taxpayer dollars to elevate some religions above others. That is just unconstitutional every way you cut it. The consequences at this point are limited to one state, but because of this precedent, that is one too many. It only takes one small step to set a harmful, dangerous precedent that will change everything. There are already rumors that HHS plans to turn this waiver into a nationwide policy. Make no mistake about it, that would be nationwide religious discrimination. The consequences of an action like that would reach far beyond our child welfare system. It's not much further down the road before out-and-out discrimination against people of particular faiths, gender identities, and sexual orientations under the guise of religious freedom bleeds into other areas of American life. These debates are going to keep hitting the courts, and they're going to keep confronting the Congress. The Trump administration, Republican lawmakers, and Republican judges are ensuring that happens. I mentioned at the outset that this debate is tied to a nomination that the Senate may take up today. We'll see about later in the week, and it involves the Commissioner for Children, Youth, and Families at Health and Human Services. I have made that judgment after a lot of reflection, Mr. President, that I am not going to stand in the way of that vote. I believe Ms. Elizabeth Darling is qualified. But in making that judgment, I was not willing to let today pass without sounding an alarm on a very dangerous precedent the Trump administration has set in this field. What this is about is the prospect of state-sponsored religious discrimination, and in this case, it's going to come down hardest on vulnerable kids in our country. I believe it's clear what's happening is unconstitutional. And I'll close by saying again, there is bipartisan interest in improving our child welfare system. The distinguished president of the Senate is from Utah. I wish he could have seen Chairman Hatch and I work together on Families First. Mr. President, as you know, when Chairman Hatch got enthused about something, he was really enthused. And Marian Wright Edelman came to both of us, and this was her dream for 30 years, to try some fresh approaches in terms of helping these kids. And in effect, what Families First does is it creates a third option. You have kids in homes where a parent might have gotten caught up in drugs or alcohol. We can get them some help. There's the foster care option. We've got some very good foster care facilities in this country. We got some that aren't exactly so great. So what Chairman Hatch and I said, and Democrats and Republicans on the Finance Committee said, and eventually the Congress on a bipartisan basis said, we're going to do better by these vulnerable kids, and we created a third option. And one of it built on a dream that I was part of. Back when I was director of the Great Panthers, we were advocating for something called Kinship Care, where grandparents could play a bigger role in stepping in and trying to help these vulnerable families, where maybe a son had gotten in trouble with the law, a daughter-in-law had had problems with alcohol and the like. The grandparent could help out. Well, under Families First, Chairman Hatch, a Republican, and I, as a Democrat, said, we're going to try and help those families. We're going to try to give them help. If you've got a son who's had problems with alcohol and drugs, they are going to be able to get some help. The grandparent can step in and get some help. We're going to create more options for the most vulnerable families and most vulnerable youngsters in America. We were moving forward. We were moving forward to be able to say, and this, of course, is not driven from Washington, D.C., it's driven at the state level. The President of the Senate is a former governor, moving forward. Now we have the Trump administration seeking to move backwards. There are nearly 500,000 kids in foster care in this country. Democrats and Republicans ought to keep building on the work that Chairman Hatch and I was proud to be his partner, with him as the chairman, in this effort to help those kids stay safe and get ahead in life. Now the Trump administration is spending taxpayer dollars not to help those kids, but to promote discrimination. That is not the way to help these kids, not the way to help these families, and I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join me in opposing these policies of discrimination. Mr. President, I yield the floor.